Hi, welcome to Governance Bites. I'm Mark Banicevich, and today I'm lucky to spend time with Melanie Purdey. Hi Melanie.
Hi Mark, it's really good to be here and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. It's really great to have Melanie here. Mel was has had experience as a CEO of a large advisor network business in New Zealand and now is a consultant working in the area of governance training, governance advice and compliance training and so forth in the financial services industry. So a really broad and strong skill set in this area. So I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Good. I do too. We'll see what transpires.
See what happens.
We'll see what comes out.
Excellent. Well, you've been doing a lot of work in the space of governance and compliance as well in smaller businesses. So many people think of governance as something that boards of directors do for large businesses where the owners are separated from the people running the business, shareholders separated from management. Is governance then relevant to small business and how?
It's very relevant to small businesses in ways possibly not as sophisticated as big boards, but in ways that are even more important for small businesses, particularly in New Zealand. Such a vast majority of our registered companies are small to medium-sized businesses. So for us to be a truly sustainable economy that both New Zealanders and global traders or customers can get comfortable with and have some assurance with, making sure that those small businesses are run with a degree of credibility and good governance, which is really just good business practice, is really important. But it's not scary. I mean, people hear the word governance and it almost sounds a bit intimidating, but if you think about it, when you buy a car, you exercise governance. You do your due diligence in finding out what your needs are as a person or a family. You look and research in the market what kind of vehicle is going to best suit those needs, and you make a decision based on what are my biggest risks or concerns, what are my objectives, and what's going to fill that. That's governance. That's doing your due diligence. Then when you buy that car, you get a warrant of fitness, and you get it tuned up once a year by the manufacturer, whoever is doing that for you, to ensure that it continues to run safely. You get the tires done. That's managing risk, which is also the role of any director, regardless of any size of business that you're operating. So it's not scary. It's really just understanding, where's my business going? What are the biggest risks to me fulfilling that strategy? And what am I going to do about them? How am I responsibly going to make sure I've actually managed those risks? Doesn't mean risk is going to go away, but it does mean you can at least hand over heart say, I've done everything I could do within my powers of observation and management to make sure that we either avoid or at least lessen the impact of some of those risks that could hit us.
Right, and you're absolutely right when you mention the statistic that most, in fact it's a huge majority, over 80% I think of New Zealand businesses that are very small. And we have a framework here where anyone essentially can start a business and become a director in 10 or 15 minutes without any knowledge of what the obligations or liabilities of a director are and what it means to run a business. And so, of course, you don't start a business being an expert in running business. You start a business being an expert in some other area, some trade or some skill set that you're trying to sell to other people. And so the skill set of running a business and governing a business is quite a different skill set for most people that are stepping into that space. So yeah, very, very strong point there. And I love the analogy that you've given about the car, because we often talk about this concept of spending more time on the business rather than in the business. And that's a lot of what it comes down to, isn't it? Just taking a step back and considering the company itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big challenges small businesses have in New Zealand, because they are often single directors, is ensuring that they have an appropriate amount of challenge to their governance. Larger boards have that. They've got other directors on the board, they've got their CEO or management team. So they're always what I like to call the board antagonist, someone who can say, hey, hang on a minute, have you thought about this? And that's something that single directors don't often have. And so being able to include that somehow, whether it's a really trusted mentor or even an experienced business person, a family member or friend who you can sit down with from time to time and say, this is what I'm thinking about. What do you see as potentially some of the drawbacks or the risks that I should be aware of? Too few single directors actually take the opportunity to invite that kind of feedback. And I think that that's probably a gap that many would find in our industry. And I'll give you an example. Feedback's so critical. If my business strategy, for instance, is to target a specific niche market, I need to understand what that market needs all the time. And the only way I can do that is by getting continuous feedback from my clients and from other people who represent that particular market, and having somebody potentially challenge me or give me director type feedback or advisory board feedback so that I stay relevant. The minute I stop being relevant, I lose my niche market, and that's a huge risk to the business. And it's a very small piece of governance, we'll use that word because that's what we're operating on, but it really is just good business practice to make sure that you are testing that all the time, because we know people's tastes, trends, needs change with such speed today because of our changing global economics and social, political, and social needs and that type of thing, that's just a really good example of something, for instance, you'd want to make sure as a small business owner you were testing on a regular basis. And that's what effective governance looks like for a small business. This is what I want to do. This is what I think the risks are, and this is what I'm going to do to manage them. Now I regularly want to test. Are the things I've put in place to manage those working for me or not? How often am I going to test them? If they're a big risk, I probably want to test them more regularly than if they're a relatively small risk. And it's just understanding some of those dynamics in your business. And you're quite right. A lot of our people who are directors of small businesses, they're really, really skilled in other areas. And so sometimes what they actually grasp or understand about even their legal obligations as directors is relatively unevolved. And we certainly see that a lot with a lot of the businesses that we deal with.
So I think there's two key things that I really want to take from that. One is, if you're running a business and you don't have the foundational knowledge of what your obligations are, what it actually means to run a business, then find out. Spend some time getting educated, or find a mentor or someone to work with to understand what those obligations are and make sure you're on top of them, because you are liable for them whether or not you know what they are.
I mean, just Google the Companies Act 1993 and at the very least read sections sort of 130 to 145. If you do nothing else, go there and know what your base director's duties are.
Absolutely. And then the other thing I think that you've brought up there that is very powerful is, if you're the sole person running this business, then get feedback. Find somebody to work with who will challenge you. Not somebody who's going to agree with you on everything, but somebody that's going to challenge you and get you thinking, so that when you are coming to make a decision, you may have framed up and said, this is what I've thought about, these are the risks that I've anticipated, what have I missed? And having that person that can come in and say, well, actually, you've kind of missed this angle, to make sure that you don't make any false, any poor steps through missing some of those key points.
And it's hard to do. I'll be the first one to admit, I fall in love with my own ideas. And I think, this is it. This is going to work. This is going to be the next best thing since sliced bread. And it's really hard to imagine that I couldn't have worked it out all by myself. And it's actually a little bit scary to, put on your big boy pants and go ask someone, challenge me. Like, this is what I'm thinking. Can you see any issues with it? It's hard because, we think we've got it worked out. We think we have a really good idea. And I do get that because, I've been guilty of that where, I haven't taken feedback when I should have done. And when I did grow up and get my, stuff together and decide to ask somebody who I respected, I avoided some missteps that I would have otherwise had made if I didn't have that, and probably they saved me a lot of money and time and heartache.
Right. I actually bring this right back to early school days, because I remember finishing my time at university, and when I started teaching at university, thinking how valuable it is to have somebody else read your essays before you submit them. And I think we come up through this very individualistic approach through school when you're writing essays and answers to things, that you write it and you submit it. And it's a much better approach that I would now in hindsight either have a parent or a friend or a colleague or someone read through it for me and give me some feedback, or alternatively, if you can plan your time appropriately, where you write it a month in advance and then come back to it a month later with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
So if we were to change the way that we teach our children from an education perspective to bring that need for feedback in prior to submission, it would be far more likely that when we come into things like businesses or careers, it just becomes more natural to say, hey, look, I've had a go at this, a pretty solid attempt, can you just give me some feedback on it? And that would make us much better business owners.
Oh, absolutely. I could never be a writer. I would never want someone to edit my work. I think I'd feel so, proprietorial about it. And I think as business owners too, and I have run a number of businesses both in Canada and in New Zealand, in the manufacturing industry, in the health care industry, in financial, and also in retail. So I've sort of come across, a number of different types of sets of risk, if you will.
Yes.
And in every instance, I can honestly say the times that I actually invited input from objective third parties, I was far more successful than those that I thought, I'm going to fly this solo and I know what I'm doing.
Right. So the first strong message, I think, from here is get feedback. Always get continuous feedback from someone that you trust who will challenge you.
Yeah. When you're actually, currently I sit in a role where I actually assess the effectiveness of a director or a board as part of the consulting work that we might do for them. And one of the things we actually do assess is capacity. How much time or resource does this director or board have to actually look out for the governance of the business? Have they built a business plan that they review annually? Have they attended to their risk testing exercises in the business? Quite often smaller businesses come up short on that because, as you pointed out right at the very beginning, if you're an advisor or a therapist or whatever, you're incredibly good at those things, and naturally your time is consumed doing that thing that is your happy zone and the thing that you know and do really well. We have a tendency as human beings to set aside those things that we're less comfortable with.
Yes.
And that's where directors of small business can find they might come unstuck a little bit. So if you are a director, just understand you do need to find some capacity in your working life to attend to those things. And it doesn't have to be a lot.
No.
Every business needs will be different. Some are going to be very low-risk businesses. Some are very high-risk businesses. Certainly something in the healthcare is probably a little bit higher risk because you're dealing with people's physical well-being.
Yes.
So there's a lot to consider. Whereas in retail, a fast-moving retail, there's less at stake there,
Yes.
even though there's other risks involved. So governance for your business, depending on what it is, needn't be overly sophisticated. It can be really straightforward, but it does need to happen.
Yeah, for the small businesses that we deal with in financial services, I often suggest that they start by blocking every week 2 hours in their diary.
Yep.
And you can flex from there.
Yeah.
You can cut it back or extend it as you need to, but a couple of hours a week out of your 40 is a really good place to start, and it just shows that you dedicate a little bit of time and you get big results from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if it's just a little bit of a webinar training, that you find a good webinar on something that's happening in the markets or with cybersecurity or whatever is the mot du jour that happens to be. And I mean, cyber is a good place to start, for instance, because that's a risk for everybody who handles any data, client information, for instance. Exactly. Well, exactly right. And there's all sorts of resources and opportunities to get some training in that, which is really critical because one of your responsibilities as a director in the Companies Act is to guardian the company's information. So if you're not aware of that, you might not be doing it. Now you're aware of it, so do it and take, and get some what they call continuous professional development training, because that is an obligation of directors as well, is that you're not only competent to do your role, but that you have ongoing competency that you can evidence in your role.
Yes.
Why is that important? if there was ever a dispute or a complaint or an issue arose, or heaven forbid a legal pursuit of any sort, you want to be able to demonstrate that you have acted in good faith and in the business's best interest, which, heads up, those are two of your director's duties.
Yes, absolutely. And in terms of protection of data, you've also got the Privacy Act over the top of that has even more detail in that requirement to protect client information.
Yep.
So yes, another really strong point that we made earlier as well is spend some time, if you don't know what your obligations are as a director, spend some time to learn them and get some education around this space.
And there's lots available. I mean, if you look, the Institute of Directors has courses, businesses like ours have courses, depending on what field you're in. There are even options available for directors on not-for-profits and various, sporting organizations and that type of thing. Yeah. So there is, you won't have to look hard to find some version of a director's training. To get what you need.
And some of them are available for free, so you can start with the free ones and then pick and choose from there. So what sort of governance activities would a small business do?
I think first and foremost, I'd say you want to, if you don't already have one, write a business plan.
Yes.
If you've got a business plan, pull it out, review it. Does it still make sense today? That business plan will be your compass to where your risks are. Identify your risks. Sit down and think, what's the worst thing that could happen to my business? How likely is that to happen? How big an impact on the business will it be? You might have 3 risks. You might have 25 risks. But identify what you think those are. And this is where having a really trusted mentor or confidant can help. So what would you see as the biggest risks to my business? Again, we get blinded by our own wonderful ideas, and we sometimes can't see those, so that's really valuable. Once you've identified those risks, then you know what your compliance assurance program or your governance calendar or your activities, whatever you want to call it, are that you need to be addressing for the year. So if my biggest risk is privacy of my client's information, clearly I want to make sure I understand what technology security I have around that. Do I have 2FA? Am I using it? How often do I or my team change our passwords? Are our passwords long enough? Are they so that they can't be hacked, etc.? So those, once you know the risks, then you'll understand what your activities need to be to ensure you're running good governance.
And then those compliance activities come down to checking that everyone is doing things in your business the way that you want them to be done to minimise those risks and to meet the plan and continue in the strategic direction that you've set.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as you said right at the start, governance really is just good business practice. It is, as I said earlier, taking time to step back from the day-to-day operations of what you do, delivering your service, talking to your clients, and spending time thinking about where the business is going and what the risks to that are.
Yeah, absolutely. You, as a director of a small business, your own business, or even a 2 or 3 director business, which I would still sort of put in the small-ish category, you are so courageous and so brave for having the initiative to actually implement an idea and bring a service to New Zealanders. And I think that's outstanding. So make sure you wrap it up with that bow of governance so that you know you can be trusted, your clients can trust you, you've done everything you can to make sure that your business hits as few big swells along its journey. I say that because I just got off a cruise, so some of those were really hard when the boat came down hard and everybody fell. But it doesn't take a lot. It doesn't have to be sophisticated, but it needs to be done.
Yes, absolutely. We haven't really talked too much in the detail of compliance, but that checking that everything's going well. I often describe it to people that compliance isn't something you have to do because someone else says you have to do it.
That's right.
Compliance is the angel on your shoulder as a director, helping you get confidence that your business is running the way that you think it is running, and even checking on yourself.
Yes.
You know, we talked before about getting feedback and how it's easy to make poor decisions without getting feedback on those decisions.
Yeah.
So, and governance to a large extent is the same thing, right? It's the angel on your shoulder, just making sure that you're taking your head up and looking forward and thinking a bit more broadly around the business, rather than just going day to day and potentially spiraling downward if you don't see a shift in the market and so forth.
And if it's not something you do or love to do, outsource it. There's all sorts of, you know, consultants or professionals in the market who, weirdly, governance is our nerdy passion, and you know, we're there to help businesses with that if it's not where they want to spend their time.
Yes.
I often say I know how to clean my house. I know how to scrub a bathroom and make sure the toilet's hygienic, but that's not what I want to be doing. I feel I can use my time more productively looking after my clients, for instance, than cleaning my house. So I outsource that to somebody else. That's good value to me.
Yes.
So think about really what resources you're using most productively in your business. And this is potentially another risk for small business owners. If you do find that the time spent working out what you need to be doing and how to be doing it and doing your testing in the governance space is usurping too much of your time from clients or manufacturing or whatever it is you do, then you may want to actually consider, is the price of outsourcing that possibly better for the business than my time being distracted from that area of expertise that brought me into this in the first place. So
you have to put a value on the time that you're spending doing those activities as well as the enjoyment, and think about how much is it costing, you know, if you were the opportunity cost of that time going to spend more time with clients and generate revenue for the business. If you were to carve up that chunk of time and pay someone else to do it, you'd probably generate more revenue for the business.
Absolutely.
Going out and spending time on productive stuff. Yeah, absolutely. So what sorts of governance skills should a director of a small business seek to attain?
It's a really good question. I think first and foremost, as you know, we've already touched on, just getting some awareness around what are your duties as a director. If you understand those, a lot will fall out of that.
Yes.
That's going to be relevant to your specific business, whatever that is. I think too, understanding how to assess risk. A lot of people don't really understand. It's sometimes not too difficult to identify risk, but how do I actually understand what this risk means to my business? Exactly. You know, how likely is this thing to happen? How big an impact will it have? That's a really good skill is to actually understand how do I, as you said, how do I assess risk so that I know what I then need to do, review.
Which ones do I focus on?
Exactly right. So I think that's really critical. Obviously, I think understanding the general regulatory environment that your business operates in. So if you're in the financial services industry or in the real estate industry or the legal industry or the accounting industry, healthcare industry, there are a number of regulatory requirements that your business needs to meet.
Yes.
So you're going to have to make sure you are fully fluent in those, because in a lot of instances you need to be licensed to operate in those areas. And one of the biggest risks to your business is losing your license.
Yes.
So unless you have made yourself really aware in your regulatory environment, you could find that.
And also the more general regulatory environment around all business as well, you know, in terms of your tax obligations, your consumer dealing obligations, fair trading, those sorts of things. It's really important to understand those too.
Yeah, definitely. And this is where, as I say, if you're not sure, a little bit of Google research can go a long way, and also possibly having an hour consulting with an expert in the field who can kind of point you in the right direction if you're not sure.
Absolutely. Very, very important. And a starting point for some of those obligations would be your accountant or potentially your legal advisor if you have one. And,
yes,
and then some specific consulting from somebody who's focused on your industry would be very, very valuable.
Yeah.
Great. So if we take then a small business that's moving, that's growing and becoming larger, and potentially at some point they may move from being management-led to more independent governance-led. What advice would you give to a business that's moving through that transition?
I think creating a bit of a timeline for what strategic moves you're planning to make to get to that stage,
Yes.
and when. And while you might not in your growth journey be ready for a board of directors, most businesses can bring in a temporary advisory board consultant or business or panel of expertise who can come in and do. It might be just for 6 months. So we're going to do this, we're digitizing this, we need to understand how we're going to get through it and manage the risk and manage the growth and manage our financial obligations as directors as well around that, of which there are some. So we don't need a long-term board of directors, but we are going to bring in for 6 months a team that'll help us do this. That team or person could have specific skills in the area that you're doing. So if it's a digital change, for instance, you might want to bring somebody who has those kind of technical skills that can actually help kind of drive and govern sort of where you go till you get to that next step. Once you get there, then you can decide what the next one is. But mapping that growth out is a really valuable exercise.
And that kind of approach continues to be important for a full governance model, right? Where a business will look at its strategy, determine what its strategic needs are over the next sort of 3 to 5 years, and then ensure that they have skills and expertise in those areas around the table of the board of directors. And so this advisory board concept that you're talking about is essentially the same thing in a really almost a more agile way, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
So as you say, for the next 6 months, this is a need for our business, so we're going to pull somebody in to help us as a director of this business, as you say, an advisory director, so they're not a full director, for that shortened period to help us through this challenge. And then once that challenge is done, that person can leave the board and you can bring the next person in that you need for their skill set.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and it's a good cost-effective way to manage it as well, because it's not necessarily inexpensive to have a full board of directors, particularly for a smaller business.
Absolutely. Yeah, great. Okay, well, a couple of general questions then. With your very extensive actually background leading companies and now of course training and governance and so forth, what's the best advice you've been given either as a chief executive or as a director?
Well, probably the lessons I learned best were from the mistakes I made and possibly from the mistakes other people made as well. So nothing, I think, is a better training ground than being part of possibly dysfunctional boards or dysfunctional businesses, because you understand how quickly the wheels can come off if the people and the cultures and the values aren't aligned. That's probably really important. And I think as well, I would have to say I didn't fully understand the dynamic between management scope and governance scope between your management team and your board of directors, as well as I could have done in order to make sure that some of the interactions we had moved a little bit more effectively. So as I said, I've probably made a lot of mistakes that have given me the best insight to help some of the people we consult with now today.
That particular one is a very challenging area because there's no strong black and white definition of what is management and what is governance, right? It can vary from company to company. So it's about understanding where the borders are for this business that you're working in.
That's a really important piece of having an effective government or effective board. If we're doing a review, we are looking at clarity of roles. Have you been really specific with what role and what the scope of what the board's where their jurisdiction begins and ends, and what you scope out for your management team to actually have accountability or responsibility for as well. I think the biggest challenge, and if directors, especially sole directors, don't have challenge or somebody in their business to press them and give them feedback, the biggest challenge is probably understanding that an advisory board person, or if you have independent directors on your board, aren't there to pat your back.
No.
There's a reason that most CEOs hate board meetings. And it's usually because you're going to walk in and get challenged. And if you're not prepared to get challenged, you have to prepare to accept the consequences, because that challenge is what you're there for. I sit on the advisory board of maybe 20 different businesses in our industry, and I often say to them, I'm not your gold star guy. I'm not coming here to give you, gold stars or a pat on the back because you're doing everything perfectly. I'm here to find the holes. That's my job.
Yes.
We work in the finance industry, so a lot of our advisors are out there trying to protect their clients from risk. You are my client. I'm trying to protect you from risk. So you may not take my advice or recommendations, but I'm going to find where your risks are and I'm going to point them out to you.
Yes.
And I'm going to give you some ideas as to how you can fix them. And unless you're in a mindset that you're going to kind of be okay with somebody saying, this needs fixing and that needs fixing, and have you thought about that, then you will probably, as I said, you may unfortunately be the victim of whatever the impact is, or not so productive board meeting.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So what then now would be the best advice that you would give to a new director, someone starting out in the field?
I'd say take a director's course of some sort. Just at least know your basic legal obligations under the Companies Act in New Zealand. Start there, and that will point your way to a lot of other things that you're going to realize, okay, I probably need to know more about this, or in my business, I can see already this could be a risk.
Yes.
And so maybe I want somebody to give me feedback on that, or I want to research that.
So in New Zealand, we've got Governance New Zealand, we've got the Institute of Directors, as you mentioned, and then companies like the Compliance Refinery that are more targeted to a particular industry. Other jurisdictions in other countries, there'll be their own organisations around governance that is absolutely well worth seeking out, and get some training. It comes down to that, right? Understand your job before you step into the job.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not too late. I mean, we've got obviously in New Zealand, we have a number of directors of small businesses who have been doing that for years. If you haven't done it before, make it a priority to, at Christmas time, when you've got, a quiet January, give yourself a couple of days to do some training in your director's duties and obligations.
Yeah, so if you're running a company now and you're not sure what governance is, do some research, get a little bit of training. As I say, things like Sports New Zealand, if you're involved in sports, have got free governance training available on their learning management system. So there are a lot of things out there. And as you said right at the start, governance is good business.
Absolutely.
And so I would almost guarantee that anybody who is running a company and does take some time to learn about governance and to implement some of these things into their business is almost guaranteed to have a stronger and better business at the end of it.
There are statistics that show business growth and business sustainability based on the correlation between the amount of time that they devote to governance activities in the business.
Right.
So it's proven. You don't have to take our word for it. And those stats are easy to find too. It's a fact.
Yeah, great. Well, that's been a great conversation, Melanie.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for your time.
I've enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, it's been great to see you. And I'll look forward to seeing you next episode.